of monarchy, which is relevant to the evolution of monarchy to the place that we are now. I hope you will see the connections, and if not, I will draw them out if we can have a discussion at the end. My focus in this series of talks is the foundational period in the development of Reformed Protestant political thought. The foundational period, which I defined last time as extending from the mid-1500s. John Calvin died in 1564. The shape of his ministry, the duration of his ministry in Geneva was the 1540s through the 1560s. From that period through the late 1600s, life changes significantly, politics changes significantly, and religious life changes significantly all over the countries affected by the Reformation after the turn of the century in 1700. That's a later era. So I'm going to be focusing mainly in this series of talks on the laying of the foundations in that roughly 150-year period from Calvin's time up through the, in English history, the Glorious Revolution, 1688, when the Whigs finally triumphed and settled much of the issues that were in dispute at the time of the Reformation in that part of Europe. This was an era of widespread and ongoing, enduring political turbulence. There are all kinds of different eras of political turbulence. This was among the most turbulent, I think, in the history of the modern world. And it was turbulent for many reasons. Two I want to emphasize in this context. One is, of course, the Reformation itself. And if you know anything about the Reformation, you know that it just unleashed I would characterize it as hellacious political struggle. A political struggle among the competing religious forces, especially the Reformed, the Lutheran, the Anglican, and the Roman Catholics for control of one country after another, that went on and on and on and involved what are appropriately characterized as religious wars that were both international and civil in character. So part of the reason for the turbulence was religion, the struggle over the issues raised by the Reformation and what quickly came to be a kind of counter movement by Roman Catholics known as the Counter-Reformation today. But the other thing that made this era turbulent was the transition from a feudal political order, which was going on, you might say, independently. You can analytically separate it out, a transition politically from a feudal political order to the emergence of the foundations of modern nation states. Let me say that again. From a feudal political order with loose territorial boundaries, with decentralized authority, to an era in which territorial divisions among countries became more precise, and there was a centralization of political authority in the creation of modern nation states. And this was done more often than not by monarchs, by people who were trying to create monarchies in the countries involved. The so-called new monarchs in places like England and France and Spain, to some extent in Scandinavia, the new monarchs had an agenda for political modernization. It's sometimes a little bit difficult for Americans to understand the creation of monarchy, especially a particular form of monarchy as a strategy for modernization, but that's exactly what it was. And I'll be trying to make that clear as we go along. So two big developments that lead to this just incredible political turbulence. One is the Reformation, and at the same time going on in most of the countries involved, a gradual shift to a new political order involving the creation of laying the foundation of modern nation states. Now, the Reformed response to this latter development, that is the emergence of modern nation states and being carried out under the auspices of the new monarchs, was very critical and very often hostile. Critical and often hostile. And that resulted in an ongoing battle between the people who were involved in shaping the foundations of our particular brand of Christianity, Reformed Christianity, an ongoing battle between them and the defenders, proponents, advocates of these new nation states that were being constructed around the institution of monarchy. And this battle that went on and on and on was not just a battle in practical politics, it was equally a battle in the theory of politics. One of the most important things that you discover when you get into the study of these matters at all seriously is that generally people, even if they are proponents of a kind of realpolitik, of practical, down-to-earth politics concerned mainly with power, at one point or another are also interested in legitimacy, the legitimacy of their power, the legitimacy of the policies that they advocate. And in this era in particular, I'm not sure it's ever gone away, but this era in particular, legitimacy was closely connected with religious ideas. And so as these new and different religious ideas, new and different interpretations of Christianity began to emerge at the time of the Reformation, religious legitimacy was very much a challenge for political leaders who were trying to make inroads into the old order and create something new and different. Now, before I get into Reformed political thought and its response to all of this, I want to talk about what they were up against. I'm not at all inclined to believe that a group like this is uninformed about the thing I'm going to be discussing, but I want just to put us all on the same page, so to speak. I want us to just make a few comments about the phenomenon, which to some extent is, I think, still with us, of absolutism. The phenomenon of absolutism, which was the target of so much Reformed criticism in the period I'm talking about. And that's the way they came very quickly to be known, the absolutists, the defenders of absolute rights for monarchies. So I'll talk about the alternative to that in a moment, but absolute monarchy was the common term. Absolutism was the common term to characterize the aspirations of those who wanted strong monarchies with extraordinary powers to be able to accomplish this, what I've characterized as a strategy, a program of modernization. The religious form that this took in terms of ideas was, of course, the idea of the divine right of kings. The kings get their authority directly from God, not from any intermediary institution. Divine right of kings. There were many books written in this period in defense of very extraordinary, wide-ranging claims on the part of monarchy that had this divine right of kings flavor. And then there were secular forms of the same thing, which were centered, interestingly enough, on the concept of sovereignty. This is an era in which the idea of sovereignty enjoys great currency, and it was oftentimes used to defend the powers that were being concentrated in the monarchy. Now, more specifically, what this whole project of creating strong monarchies entailed around the idea of absolutism or sovereignty was the following: that power and authority should be concentrated in a national monarch. Power and authority should be concentrated in a national monarch. The advocates of it said, this is what we need to do in order to, first of all, defend ourselves in the geopolitical struggles of the time. This is what we need to be able to do in order to accomplish great things in the world, but also it is essential to our security, our national security. And you begin to hear terms just like that, because of course, as nation states define territorial boundaries, try to enforce them, you're on your way to a sense of nationalism. It's not there yet, but you're beginning to see the foundations of that. I believe in an earlier set of talks at Bradley Hill some years ago, I talked about the relationship between the Reformation and the emergence of modern nationalism. And the thing I'm talking about right now, is at the heart of that. So concentration of power and authority in a national monarchy, as opposed to what? The diffuse authority, which was characteristic of feudalism. The whole movement here is away from the dispersal of authority and power that was characteristic of feudalism, in the direction of a kind of concentrated authority and power in one single institution. Now, the other side of that was a resistance to any sort of power sharing. We stress that, a resistance to any sort of power sharing, and be it with nobles or the church or any other institution. These national monarchs wanted as much as possible to avoid having to share power with any other institution. And in cases where there was something like a parliament, of course, that was at the center of it. Resistance to any kind of control by the institution of a parliament. Thirdly, it also entailed a rather explicit, rather open and explicit, and sometimes in the law itself, rather explicit insistence that in terms of making policy, and especially policy on matters of high political significance, there should be no independent constraints on the right, the freedom of sovereigns to be able to do what they wish. No independent constraints on the exercise of power. And the thing in particular that's important here is no legal constraints on the monarch's ability to make decisions regarding high politics. And of course, that also implied no independent authority for the church vis-a-vis civil authority. To put it in maybe in one phrase, another very important part of the whole agenda, the whole program of these new monarchies was give the monarch a free hand. Give the monarch a free hand so that he or she, as the case may be, can do what is necessary for the good of the country, locally, but also for the good of the country in terms of geopolitics. Still another part of this was an empowerment of the state. Here you begin to have the foundations of modern statecraft, an empowerment of the state to get the revenues necessary to carry out important works, military works, the creation of various public works, and of course all that rested on taxation. All that rested upon taxation. Expanded powers of taxation was another very important part of this agenda. And the final thing I want to mention, which is just echoed in my mind as I thought about the things we've been watching over on the other side of the pond this past week, is typically the new monarchies, the building up of the new monarchies, the creation of the new monarchies involved a lot of symbolic activity trying to emphasize the grandeur of the monarch with all kind of ceremony and all kind of costume and so forth. There was a kind of spectacle of monarchy which was designed to emphasize, above all, the distance between the monarch and the rest of the population. And as a result of that, or as a part of that, I should say, not a result of it, you get these larger than life figures like Henry VIII or Elizabeth herself, or Francis I in France, or of course Philip in Spain. Larger than life figures, swashbucklers, if you will, moving across the face of Europe, and in a sense also moving across the face of Europe with kind of as symbols of both national power, but also of power vis-a-vis the rest of the population. Now, the practical argument for this, this whole thing that I've just been sketching out, and it appealed to many people. It appealed to lots of people. That's one of the reasons there was really a struggle over it. This was not accepted readily by everybody, and certainly our spiritual forebears were active in their resistance to it. But there were many people, including people who gravitated towards power and authority themselves. People of great wealth oftentimes gravitated to it, even when this whole project that I've been describing oftentimes compromised the power and authority of the lesser magistrates, the barons, the lords. They oftentimes were threatened by it. And yet many of them were drawn to it. And in part, they were drawn to it on grounds simply of efficiency. They were struck by the fact that they were living through a time in which this was taking place. This evolution was taking place. And if they were going to be in a position as a nation, which is beginning to form in people's mind, the idea of a nation, if the nation is going to be able to defend itself well, it's going to need this kind of concentration of power. And I've mentioned it before, and I'll mention it again. A lot of times it was accompanied by the idea of great works, great achievements, which meant very often building empires alongside of it. We need geopolitical strength. We need strength internally, and this is the way to get it. Let me just introduce a parenthesis here as an aside. Some of you, many of you probably, have read at some point or another Machiavelli's Prince, which was written in this period, actually at the beginning of this period. And if you have read that work, you're probably, your first memory of it, your main memory of it is this memory that has given rise to the idea of Machiavellianism, which is quite literally a sort of argument for doing evil, as it was understood at the time, as a necessary part of political ethics. So the whole connotation of being Machiavellian comes from that. But there's one other thing which is oftentimes ignored by people who haven't read it or haven't read it recently and so forth, and that is, at the end of this work, Machiavelli appeals in the last chapter to almost a kind of plaintive appeal to his fellow countrymen living in a country which does not have a centralized monarchy, where the monarchy is an idea in people's minds at best, and there's a lot of internal dissension among the Italian city-states. He appeals for the creation of an Italian prince. And he says, this is essential to our future as a nation. This is essential to our future as a nation. If we're going to be able to defend ourselves, let alone achieve great things, we need a centralized power. And of course, then you can read the whole of the Prince, that work, as a kind of manual for somebody who might undertake such a project. Now, that's background. Let me get to our own spiritual forebears. As I said, this whole project of building up these strong national monarchies and centralizing power and as much as possible resisting any sort of sharing of power was right from the get-go actively criticized and resisted by our spiritual forebears, right from the get-go. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They were critical of it. And they were critical of it in ways that involved not only the articulation of new ideas about politics, but also very, very active, practical struggles against it. I talked last time about their developing a kind of ethic of resistance, of political resistance, how they came to be known, in fact, as a party of resistance, a party of rebellion in one country after another. Well, part of the reason for that reputation was that they were actively resisting this campaign that I've been describing. Why? On what basis? You might say, and keep in mind that one of the most interesting things about the history of the Reformed tradition is, in some respects, the Reformed tradition is a stimulus to modernization. Ultimately, if you've ever read Max Weber's famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, one of the great themes of that is that Calvinism, he calls it Calvinism, was an inspiration for and a source of the emergence of modern market economies. Well, that's modernization with a vengeance. So many times people associate reformed ideas, reformed practice with modernization schemes of one point or another. And it is true that in principle, Reformed churches and Reformed churchmen have generally been on the side of modernization, whether it be economic, social, political, whatever. But in this case, it's interesting. They were very strong and rather consistent opponents of this project of national monarchy and centralization and all that that entailed. This was evident early on, very early on, in Calvin's Institutes. By the way, let me just say, I'm not citing a lot of bibliography here. Those of you who are interested, I can give you scores of things that were written during this period that are important works. But the one thing that I have to cite as a source is the last chapter, the concluding chapter, the 20th chapter of Book 4 of Calvin's Institutes, which is worth reading because it is one of the most important statements about religion and politics that's ever been made. And when I say that, I mean in terms of historical influence. Calvin never wrote a treatise on politics, but this last chapter of the Institutes, which concerned civil government, became a kind of Bible for people in the tradition that develops the Reformed tradition after Calvin's death in the 1560s. One activist after another takes up points made by Calvin and elaborates them and develops them so that it becomes a seminal contribution to political debates and political ideas. Now, in the last chapter of the Institutes, where and this is the only place where he talks about civil politics in any sustained way, Calvin is very critical of concentrated power. Let me say that again. He's very critical of concentrated power. Now he's talking about civil authority. I'll get next week to ecclesiastical authority, and that's important in its own right. But in this work, which he's talking about civil power, he is very critical of concentrated power and says, I'm summarizing, and it's not a long statement he makes, but I'm summarizing the gist of it here. He says the following, two things. One, is there an ideal regime? Is there a preferred regime? No, he says, it depends on circumstances, depends upon conditions. And by the way, I would say that's a wise statement on the part of anybody who's discussing that topic. I oftentimes think about, let me just say parenthetically, I oftentimes think about that when I hear people saying, well, democracy is the best form of government, period, full stop. Certainly it depends upon conditions and circumstances. Doesn't it obviously depend upon conditions and circumstances? Now, back to Calvin. Calvin says, in principle, it will depend upon circumstances, but as a general rule, it is undesirable to concentrate power. As a general rule, it is undesirable to concentrate power. He argues then for what he characterizes as a mixed regime, mixing elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of what we call democracy. The three things need to be woven together, and they need to be woven together in a way that makes possible a regime in which the different component parts to some extent, not only work together, but check one another. I hope that sounds familiar. Work together, but also check one another. Now, once that idea was out there, and by the way, it wasn't just because Calvin said it that it became influential in the reform, in the development of Reformed thought. There were all kinds of people who were influential. Calvin just was the most influential. So these ideas were coming from many different sources, but soon after, there erupt these religious wars in the 1570s and 1580s and 1590s and on into the next century. About 125 years of war and conflict over religion and politics. As that unfolds, very quickly, I would say, by the 1570s and 1580s, there develops a principled opposition to the idea of concentrating power in a single institution, let alone a single figure. And that translates in turn positively into a preference for one of two different kinds of regimes. One, and this was quite common, constitutional monarchy, not absolute monarchy, but constitutional monarchy. And constitutional monarchy involved sharing of power between the monarch and other institutions like a parliament. Sharing of power, and the whole thing operating under what was commonly characterized at the time as fundamental law. We Americans would call it constitutional law. So shared power under law, under constitutional law, fundamental law. But there were some Reformed thinkers who were not content just to make that proposal. They went further and were devotees of republican government, which meant do away with monarchy altogether. And especially as the 17th century, not the 16th century, but the 17th century wore on, there were more and more reformed thinkers who said, really, the best thing to do is to do away with monarchy altogether and to replace it with a set of institutions which allow for free men to be self-governing, without the need for any sort of monarchical power. And you got that in places, pioneered in places like the Netherlands, which had a republic early on, one of the earliest republics. And by the way, the issue here is there was a form of republican government in Geneva, but it was a city-state. As you moved into nation states, it's much more complicated. And of course, the other place where republican ideas were pioneered was on this side of the Atlantic in what came to be known as New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and so forth. These are, in terms of not only the practice of politics, but the ideas of politics, very important experiments in self-government, as it was called then. So reformed political thinkers in this period, over against absolutism, rather consistently said, absolutism is not what we want, is not what our country should be seeking. We're opposed to that. And when they encountered figures like Henry VIII and then later Elizabeth and let alone Philip of Spain, they put their bodies on the line. Some of them were martyred because of their resistance to absolutist tendencies. They were proponents of constitutional monarchy or republics. Now, I'm winding up here to throw a punch, and here it comes. The obvious question is, well, on what basis did they make this claim, other than just they didn't like absolute monarchy? And I can give you practical reasons why they didn't like absolute monarchy, but what were the theoretical grounds? Keep in mind the thing I said at the very beginning of these talks last week. I'm really interested in exploring here how it was that they developed a way of thinking about politics out of their insistence on the privileged role of the Bible. These were people who said, we're going to go back to the Bible. We're going to recover a form of Christianity which we think is true and authentic, over against the Roman Catholics, over against others. And so they moved to try to develop a way of thinking about politics which they thought was scriptural. So with that as preparation, let me now go to the issue and ask, what precisely was their own justification for this antipathy to absolute monarchy and their preference for constitutional monarchy or republics? I'm going to answer that in two parts. First, it was a story that they told themselves over and over and over again about the history of Israel. That's the first part. A story that they told themselves over and over and over and over again, became a mantra in their thinking about politics, and the preachers would expound on this again and again and again. If you went to a Puritan sermon and a Puritan church, and I assure you that you heard a lot of sermons in Puritan churches, there would be recurring emphasis on the things I'm about to say. So a story that they told themselves about the history of Israel, the political history of Israel, and then secondly, a kind of theory that they developed out of, grounded in that story. Here's the story. They based their politics, insofar as they based it on scripture, primarily, I'll qualify this next week, but primarily on Israel's experience in the historical books of the Old Testament, as recorded in the historical books of the Old Testament. In those historical books of the Old Testament, they discovered the following. And by and large, I would say what I'm about to say, you may correct this impression I have, this is pretty unexceptionable. This is the story everybody gets when they look at the narrative laid out in First Kings and Second Kings and Chronicles and so forth. It's right there. Israel had experience, political experience, both with a monarchy and without a monarchy. That's the first thing to say. It was not just monarchy. Indeed, for a considerable period before their entrance into the promised land, they lived in under political forms that were not monarchy. Moses was not a monarch. They lived in that period under a set of rulers that are characterized in Scripture as the judges, who could be characterized, if Calvin were speaking of them, as lesser magistrates. You could argue, therefore, that even before the creation of the monarchy, and Israel had a long experience with that kind of thing before the creation of the monarchy, they were living under what might be characterized as a sort of proto-republican regime. Especially if you take into account the very strong emphasis placed in that period on the law and the importance of divine law as a kind of constraint upon political actors. So Israel had an experience with and without monarchy. And when you look at the history that Israel had with monarchy, what you see is the following. It is, to put it mildly, not a very happy story. Let me say that again. It is not a very happy story. Israel has a monarchy, which, and if you remember the story well, it's a monarchy that is created with a kind of grudging affirmation by the Lord. The Lord is resistance to this idea of Israel becoming a monarchy. Why? Because if Israel has a monarchy, it is likely to go the way of those other nations, the Canaanites and others who worship other deities. So there's already a suggestion in the Old Testament itself that monarchy is associated with apostasy, with religious apostasy. And then, of course, you have some good kings, to be sure, some good kings who were held up as kind of exemplary figures in the life of Israel, and yet even the exemplary figures are people who are morally compromised in various ways, as we all know. But Israel has, if you look at the long history, a long history of bad kings, of problematic kings, of kings who lead the nation astray. The story of the prophets, after all, is the prophets reminding political authorities of the promises that they have made as a covenant people that are being betrayed. So you can easily draw the conclusion, and our spiritual forebears did draw this conclusion, that monarchy is a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing, especially, very important point in the debates that took place in the 16th and the 17th century. It is a very problematic thing if it becomes a hereditary monarchy, where the people have no real active role in choosing who the monarch is going to be. And if you look at the writings of especially the Republican figures that were part of this tradition, they said the following: monarchy, especially absolute monarchy, is a kind of a recipe for, if you just take Israel's history as an example, idolatry, corruption, apostasy, abuse of power. Keep in mind, a lot of that criticism that's introduced by the prophets has to do with just simple betrayal of trust in government functioning at the most basic level. So that's the story. If you will, that is the part of the Bible that they emphasize most strongly in thinking about their own situation. And they saw direct parallels between absolute monarchy in their own time and a lot of the bad things that happened to Israel during its evolution. Now, I said this is connected with a theory, and here's the theory. The theory is this: only God is worthy of the kind of respect and deference that monarchs typically claim. Let me say that again. Only God is worthy of the kind of deference and respect which monarchs typically claim. There are really kind of interesting passages in some of the later Reformed thinkers where they say monarchy naturally draws us in the direction of worshiping them, worshiping those people. Needless to say, a very dangerous thing for the followers of Yahweh to be doing. No human being is worthy of that kind of respect. Only God is worthy of that kind of respect. By the way, they had the same thing to say about the papacy. Only God is worthy of the kind of respect that the papacy claims. And that's not just because of human limitations, finitude, it's also because of human sinfulness. They say if you have elevate a human being with the sinful propensities of human beings to a position of great honor and privilege, it is highly likely that they are going to abuse it. It's very likely that they're going to abuse that. So the only proper conclusion to draw, our forebears said, was the need to limit power, the need to limit power and to control its exercise. And above all, to insist upon its being accountable, and insist also on there being a sharing of power between human authorities. And of course, the idea of subordination to some higher law, which is understood to be above the capacity of any human being to create law. That's the gist of it. Out of it flows these pivotal ideas, conditional obedience. We should be obedient only insofar as the monarch, only insofar as even the republic is performing in a way that's consistent with the promises that we have made to one another. And therefore, when you talk about conditional obedience, the thing I talked about a lot last week, it is entirely appropriate for us to reserve the right to resist and even replace our political leaders when they go astray. And the other thing that flows out of this terribly important idea, even in our own time, I would say terribly important idea, is that if we are seeking a good form of government, a form of government which will be reliably serving the purposes that ostensibly government is meant to serve, we need a complex, mixed form of government. Complex, mixed form of government with multiple authorities acting in ways that require them to cooperate, but also to check one another. And above all, there should be mechanisms for accountability to the people. Accountability to the people. I talked last week about the idea of covenant having that implication for Reformed political thinkers as they talked about the subject of resistance and rebellion. Now, to that, I want to add one or two other things, and then I'll stop. One of the most striking things to me about reading the political writings of this period from this group of people is the following. They placed a lot of emphasis on institutions. They placed a lot of emphasis on institutions. And I hope you see what flows out of this is a kind of concern with statecraft in the most fundamental sense. That is, there are right and wrong ways to structure power. There are right and wrong ways to allocate power. And yet, at the same time, they were always insistent that institutional design alone does not suffice to create a good government. Institutional design alone does not suffice. It's important, it's necessary, but it needs to be complemented if we are to achieve what government is meant to achieve by something else. And that is appropriate moral and spiritual qualities of leaders and citizens. Appropriate moral and spiritual qualities of leaders. Good government requires people who, I'm paraphrasing here, John Milton, who was another very important contributor to this set of ideas. But at one point he said, there are profound moral and spiritual challenges that are confronted in any government, and we need people in government who take seriously the moral and spiritual responsibilities they have as leaders. We want people in public office, especially in public office, of exemplary character. Indeed, the institutions, the best institutions, can be led astray by inserting into public office people who lack the exemplary moral qualities. The ideal for our spiritual forebears on this particular topic was the following. It's just stating the obvious to say they wanted righteous people in public office, righteous people. Truly God-fearing people who are committed to true religion, And of course, this was a time in which very sharp distinctions were drawn between true and false religion. Catholicism was false. It was a deformation of the Christian religion. One of the phrases that oftentimes was used as people moved in this world was, we want churches which are truly reformed meaning reformed in a way that's consistent with what they understood to be biblical teaching. Well, as a part of this, they wanted very much, if you could get it, righteous people in positions of leadership. That was one of the key points, by the way, in the laying of the foundations of Massachusetts Bay Colony, which I'll talk about next week. And Massachusetts Bay Colony is so interesting because it's one of the few places, one of the very few places, where people who had the ideas that I've been discussing here had a free hand to do what they wanted to do. And one of the things they emphasized very strongly was this sort of intimate connection between good government and having people of the right, not just moral, but spiritual qualities as well. But I want to stress, they recognized, as they had to recognize more often than not, rarely were they in a position to do things just what they wanted. They had to collaborate with other people, whether it be in the Netherlands or in England or and so forth. If you could not have rule by righteous people, what above all you wanted, if you couldn't get that, the next best thing was public-spirited people who were committed to justice. Public-spirited people who were committed to justice. People who could be expected, as a matter of course, to rule with equity and to rise above their own petty, selfish concerns, to be even to sacrifice their own petty, selfish concerns to be concerned about the greater greater good. The interesting thing is that the Republicans in this group, where self-government became the issue, they oftentimes said a good republic can only function, a republic can only function well if it has a virtuous citizen. A republic can only function well if it has a virtuous citizenry. And one of the goals of good leaders is to create and maintain a virtuous citizenry. I'll talk a little bit more next week about that theme, which I hope you all know was not played a rather significant role in at least part of the debates that went on about the American founding, particularly in the period between the Declaration of Independence and a dozen years later, the creation of the Constitution. Final thing I want to say is this, the goal. What's the goal? You can't talk, I think, intelligently and certainly empirically about people's views about what is a desirable political form without also asking the question, well, the desirable political form in order to achieve what? In order to get what? These things are always intertwined. And in the case of our spiritual forebears, the answer is this. They wanted a society governed by righteous people, but they wanted a society governed by righteous people in order to create a whole way of life that was conducive to righteous living. A whole way of life that was conducive to righteous living. The phrase that was oftentimes used in this period was Holy Commonwealth. That, by the way, is the phrase that John Winthrop used in that famous sermon where we get the imagery of the city set on a hill in preparation for the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony, a holy commonwealth, a place where the way of life is naturally conducive to righteous living. And there were a few places, Geneva being one, Massachusetts being another, where they could actively pursue that. But oftentimes, indeed more often than not, they found themselves, as I said a moment ago, in a position where they were not entirely able to achieve what they ideally wanted. And they did have a fallback position, if you will. And when they had to share power with others, the goal was this, not a holy commonwealth, but a just commonwealth. A commonwealth in which not only were things done in the proper way, but it was a society in which people naturally were drawn in the direction of acting and being just people. Now all of that leads me into the topic, which I'm sure has been in the back of some of your minds. I haven't glanced at the chat yet, but I think it's probably in there too as well. The issue of church and state. I will take that up next week. But for the moment, let me just beg off getting into that question because it really requires sustained attention. The last thing I want to say before stopping is this. I think a lot of this is directly relevant to the big challenge of our time, which has to do with the crisis of democratic institutions in the following way. I view the current crisis as being a struggle not between, I think it's a bit of a mistake to say Democrats versus autocrats. I think the better way to understand our situation is a struggle between two different ways of thinking about democracy. One is constitutional democracy, and the other is a kind of populist democracy, which wants to dispense with all of the constitutional limitations, or at least to minimize their role. That distinction is one which flows naturally out of the things that I have been discussing. I think I'm done. So, Steve, we're now ready to let me glance at the chat here, and then we'll.
What are they wanting to say? I'd like to see, look, I want to read what.
Dropped out. I don't know if everybody else did, but I'm back now.
Well, I agree totally with John Gaffney. Our Constitution is built on the idea of shared powers. Where did that come from? It came from, above all, the Whigs, who were the, you might say, the successors of the people who were shaping the reform political tradition. The Whigs were thoroughly Protestant, and they had ideas which were sort of grounded in the things I've been discussing here. Mm-hmm. And by the way, John Gaffney's I'm trying to see who is, this is Steve Fox, I guess. We've come full circle. Absolutely, we've come full circle. That's why I mentioned the thing I did at the very end of the presentation. John Gaffney's comment, Japanese emperor to be viewed as a god, that's, I would say, even in a secularized time, it's got some sort of, there's an element of that in monarchical power, let alone imperial power. So let me entertain your questions and comments.
Stice has a question. We just lost you, Joy.
Can't hear you.
Yourself.
The European Christian monarchs reformed and not colonized and exploited and enslaved. How can this legacy of Western Christendom be explained? And then there's another comment here. The Orthodox East doesn't have this legacy, perhaps because they were dominated by others.
Well, I think the imperial project is something which unfortunately grew out of, in part, a set of assumptions that Western Christians made about the need to evangelize the rest of the world. It wasn't just that, but that was part of it. There's no doubt about it. And I don't think anybody who has read much of the relevant history can ignore the possibility that there were involved in the working out of that some pretty clearly racist assumptions. Let me speak about what I mean by that, say a word about what I mean by that. I think racism involves fundamentally the idea of a superiority of one race over another, the intrinsic superiority of one race over another. And a lot of the colonial project was sort of tacitly that. Now you have to ask the question, how could that be reconciled with, I think equally important, the fundamental egalitarianism of the Christian religion? And the answer is not easy. I think the common way to defend it at the time was to say, there's a period of tutelage that these other peoples need to undergo before they can rise to a position that's comparable to our own.
Hmm. Do you want to pick up any?
Looks like the library wants to ask a question. Patty? Unmute. You'll have to unmute on the library computer. There you go.
Diane, I have a question about other reform groups that traveled to America because they disagreed with what was going on in, say, France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the Huguenots, and then also Dutch Reform, and even later the Quakers were a similar time period. Did they also influence the politic of, say, Pennsylvania and Virginia, North Carolina, or other places where they settled, in thinking about the ideas of Republican government?
Everybody hear the question? The influence of other reform groups. Well, the Dutch Reformed, yes, to be sure. And the Dutch Reformed were part of this movement that I've been describing this morning. Keep in mind that when I say reform political thought, I'm referring not just to English-speaking sources, but to French and Dutch and some German and so forth. So these ideas were very, very much a part of the Dutch heritage. I think it's important to note that you had a Dutch Republic well before you had the comparable things in the English-speaking world. And if you remember the history, when those struggles were going on in the 17th century between the monarchy and various reformed groups, the reformed groups very often, when they fled England, did not go to this side of the Atlantic. They went to Holland, where they, and by the way, the Pilgrims, when they came over here, came from the Netherlands, what we now think of as the Netherlands. And that was a kind of, I would say it was perceived at the time as a extraordinary thing. And that was the creation of it was literally a nation that had been created through the wars of religion, didn't exist before. And it was largely reformed in its leadership and its politics, and it was Republican. And it was seen to be, I think quite correctly, as a place where there was an unusually high degree of tolerance, of religious and other kinds of tolerance. So that's one of the reasons why people who were in the Reformed camp would go there. That was one of the places they went when they felt oppressed and unable to practice their religion openly in England. Quakers are a separate proposition. The Quakers always were perceived to be a kind of they were perceived to be people who had a kind of marginal version of the Christian religion. And oftentimes were thought to be, I mentioned in my first presentation, were thought to be, they were suspected of being that anarchist fringe that the Reformation had produced. Keep in mind that when I talked last time, I said people in the Reformed tradition always had to labor with the accusation that they were anarchists because they were strong proponents of a right of resistance and a right of rebellion. The Quakers were perceived to be in that way. And the other thing about the Quakers, of course, which is very important to note, is the Quakers had some of the same sort of hesitations about seeking political power and using political power that the Anabaptists did. One of the more interesting things that emerges in the use of the Bible at the time of the Reformation is that there were these groups who believed that if you really emphasized and took seriously the New Testament, you would not seek political power. You would not seek political power. Why? Because that involved taking up the sword, doing things which were contrary to their understanding of the gospel. And the Quakers were, well, you know what they are. They've long had this very strong pacifist tradition. And that was another sort of element of their being viewed, well, not only as people with, shall we say, deviant views, really deviant views, but also dangerous views. And for that reason, they were actively persecuted. And by the way, they were persecuted not only on that side of the Atlantic, but this side of the Atlantic as well. I don't know whether I've covered the bases that you asked me to address. I will say that one other thing which is fascinating, and I'll briefly mention it now and try to get into it more next week, is Presbyterians were not in New England, hardly at all. That was the Congregationalist world. And you see this rather important split that takes place in the English-speaking world between Congregationalists and Presbyterians. That develops at the time of the English Civil War, and then develops into a kind of institutional separation on this side of the Atlantic. Very few Presbyterians in New England. New England is Congregationalist. So where are the Presbyterians then? Presbyterians were primarily located in the middle colonies. In the middle colonies of what eventually, of course, became the United States. Now, what is different about the middle colonies? Well, they were not in control, unlike the Puritans in New England. They were never in control of the middle colonies. The middle colonies were a kind of sort of elaborate experiment in religious pluralism. You had all kinds of different religious groups there. And so the Presbyterians in the middle colonies in particular, as they developed, took for granted the need for pluralism, the need for toleration, the need for collaboration with people of other faiths. And that had a profound effect upon American Presbyterianism, but more broadly, I would say the whole Reformed world, because they looked at that thing in the middle colonies and said, you know, this really can work at a time when there were so many people who assumed in order to have political stability, you had to have religious unity. Very common assumption, especially on the absolutist side. The absolutists just again and again and again assumed that you needed to have religious uniformity in order to have political stability. And a place like the middle colonies in the New World began to demonstrate something else was possible. Sorry for that long-winded lecture, but that's in order to cover those bases, I had to talk a little bit.
There's so much more ground to cover. I'm glad we've got another week to think about this. Now,
Well, I assure you, I will, you know, the issue of church and state is so interesting and complicated that it really is going to take another whole lecture to deal with it.
Now, I've had in the back of my mind here almost an invitation from you to go into territory that we don't usually go into, which is current politics. When this is far too deep a question to answer when we're already up against our time limit, but at what point does the obligation to resist an unjust government arise, and who makes that decision?
Well, I'm going to give a short answer to that. I promise you it's a short answer. The accusation made against Reformed Christians because they advocated rebellion and resistance was precisely, there is no standard. This is a recipe for anarchy. And the people on the other side of the argument, our spiritual forebears said, oh, no, there is. And it's in the Decalogue and the implications of the Decalogue, that is the 10 Commandments, for the conduct of government. They read the Decalogue as a kind of set of guidelines for righteous living, but also for how civic affairs should be conducted.
And we'll elaborate on that next week.
Good to see you all. Have a good week.
Right. Thank you, everybody. I want to flag for everyone next Tuesday's email from church. There will be a link in it from adult education soliciting your input on ideas that you may have for programs for us, your reactions to current programs that we have. We know that we have no monopoly on wisdom, and we seek the wisdom of the congregation with ideas for programs that would be good to do here. So please have a look at that just to familiarize yourself with it, because it will continue to appear from time to time. And we really are putting that in out of a sense of humility. We do want you to talk to us, please. And next week, Louise will be chairing. I'll be out of town, and I'm going to have to watch it on later on Realm, but I will very much look forward to seeing one more round with Dr. Douglas. And we thank you all for being here, and everybody go to church either personally or virtually. Thank you all.